So today we're going to take a look at a class of rockets that I designated Alpha, and the four iterations I made on Alpha: the Mark 1, the Mark 2, the Mark 2.5, because it was not really much of a change from the Mark 2, and the Mark 3. We'll watch video from all four flights, and we'll also watch video from my Level 1 certification flight that resulted out of a bet I made with a friend on my university's rocket team over the flight of the Mark III. So with that, let's jump into the video of the Alpha Mark 1. Okay, so in that video, you noticed that the rocket took off fairly well. From there, it pitched downrange. The rocket was a little heavy for the single E engine it was using. The reason it ended up pitching downrange is actually because my launch lugs were PVC, sections of PVC pipe that I'd cut out and just taped to the body tube. Which produced those nice black rings you can see on the rocket body. That little bit of weight and drag off center, coupled with not enough thrust to really get it to go anywhere, resulted in it pitching downrange and then eventually flying itself through a tree, which resulted in the rapid unscheduled disassembly of that rocket. That it ripped all the fins off, crunched the nose cone. That was the end of that rocket. So I had determined that there was not enough thrust in the Mark 1, and so moving into the Mark 2, I would need more thrust. Mark 1 also didn't have any planned recovery system, so it was already going to be a rough landing. I just figured it would be fine, since I played the CG-CP game a little too close, such that it, upon coming down, it never wanted to go nose first. It always wanted to try and fall butt first, or flamey end down. So it was always fighting its own gravity once the motor had burnt out. So aerodynamics wanted it to go pointy end first. CG wanted it to go flamey end first. So it ended up falling mostly sideways. This one never actually did that, since it was on a ballistic trajectory the whole time. Unfortunate. So then we jump into the Mark II. The Mark II, I attempted to remove the launch lugs from the equation. Just figured, cut the launch lugs out, we'll just figure out a way to hold it there and it'll go off. And I was not thinking about the fact that a launch rail is utilized to get the rocket stability before aerodynamic effects have taken over. That resulted in what you're about to see, where the rocket just kind of goes wherever it wants to. In addition to that, I added more thrust to the rocket, so I learned what the legal limit I could do without a level 1 certification on the number of rocket motors I could light off. That limit was basically four of these E-size motor tubes at once. So I packed the rocket with 4 E motors, just going, okay, yeah, it'll be fine. Shoved a bunch of igniters in it and hit the launch key. Nothing actually happened. I don't have video of that because I didn't think to video it until after all of my issues showed up. The rocket ended up needing about 18 to 20 volts to ignite all 4 motors, which is something I've now solved with my IPER launch control box. But not all 4 motors ignited simultaneously, unfortunately. So that resulted in the rocket having a very erratic flight path as it spiraled and moved any direction it wanted. So let's go ahead and watch that. So as you saw, it pretty much immediately blew up the moment it got off the pad. One of the motors actually also fell out because there was no retention of the motors. I was using the thrust of the motors pushing up to hold them into the rocket body. So when 3 of the 4 ignited, the 4th one dropped out the bottom of the rocket and then promptly ignited since the other 3 were already going, and it just it went haywire. So it punched the bottom of the rocket, sent it one direction, the motor another direction, and so that was just a game all its own. Let's watch the Mark 2.5 flight real quick, and then we'll discuss what happened between that and the Mark 2 flight that you just saw. So in the Mark 2.5 or 2.5 flight, I made multiple changes on the rocket. I went back to my launch rails or launch lug system that I used on the Mark 1 flight, utilized the same launch guide rail, but to counteract the CG and CP effects that resulted in my Mark 1 pitching downrange, I duplicated a set on the opposing side. This did fix the CG-CP problem. Unfortunately, one of the things I actually forgot previously was that only 2 of the motors actually ignited on the Mark II flight, and the 1 ignited loose. The 3rd one actually just never ignited, so I chose to reuse that motor on the Mark 2.5 flight because that saved me a little bit of money having to buy motors, because 4E motors gets expensive every flight. It's like $28 back then. But the Mark 2.5 flight resulted in a wonderful takeoff initially. The motor that had been on the Mark II flight, about a second into flight, just blew up. Went off like a firecracker. That resulted in dislodging the nose cone, blew that totally off. Took one of the other motors and set it loose, so we had that one now flying loose around the yard. And we then had only 2 motors powering the rocket. And unfortunately, they were not opposing each other, they were the ones right next to each other, and so the rocket just did rolls and loops through the air, which of course resulted in it landing nose first and very burnt. Another thing I'd done with this rocket is I used fireworks fuse to ignite it rather than doing an electronic igniter. That resulted in the fins lighting themselves on fire, so I was missing a substantial portion of my fins come the end of the flight. Okay, so before we talk about the Mark III flight, let's go ahead and watch the Mark III flight real quick. So right off the bat, you'll notice some significant differences with the Mark III flight. The Mark III flew with wooden fins rather than cardboard fins. It also had a longer nose cone that I purchased at a local hobby store. It's actually meant for crafting with flowers, setting up floral arrangements. And the rocket was actually built in 3 segments: a motor segment, a mid-body tube, and the nose cone. And I actually had a parachute on board for the idea that a parachute was supposed to deploy. This flight actually worked really well. All 4 motors went off, and it flew around. Unfortunately, initially they didn't all ignite at the same time. They ignited at different times, which resulted in you seeing it jump off the pad and then wait for a moment and then continue off the pad. So that resulted in the thrust being differential, so one of the motors burnt out before the rest and was at a different point in its thrust curve, so the rocket still spiraled through the air and crashed into a tree. It did deploy the parachute in the tree, and I was able to recover it. Unfortunately, this was not a successful flight. As I mentioned previously with the Mark III, I had made an agreement or a bet with a friend on my university's rocket design team that if my Mark III rocket did not succeed in flight, that was the only arrangement we had. There was no definition on it. It had to be a RUD, it had to be an explosion or anything. It just had to not succeed. That was our only agreement. And this one didn't succeed. And if it didn't succeed, I had to sign up for the level 1 workshop that the team puts on for all of the freshmen that join their team, allowing them to get their level 1 certification through the AAA Rocket Society. So in losing the bet, I had to sign up for their level 1 workshop, which ended up being a wonderful time. I learned a lot about building rockets, especially at the high power class, what it takes to truly hold a motor in place, how simple you can get at certain times, and a lot of what I learned there has since influenced my design decisions as I've been working on Viper, which is my next class of home-built rockets since the Alpha rocket and some other iterations around the Alpha. The flight of it was awesome. We went up to Midwest Power in Illinois, put on by the Quad City Rocket Society. Shout out to you guys. That was an experience. Having rockets going off around you, feeling the shock waves as every motor goes off. When you get a rocket that breaks the speed of sound before it leaves the launch pad, it's cool. So we'll go ahead and run my cert flight. I did successfully fly. I successfully certed. My rocket came down undershoot, and it was fully relaunchable upon recovery. I named my rocket Arrow. It was Green Arrow themed, so I'll throw in some pictures of me in a Green Arrow costume with my rocket at the launch site. So, enjoy.
And launch.
Tons of fun to watch, and always has a lot of data to back up every decision he makes and every failure he has. So, may your skies be blue and your winds be low. So one thing I forgot to mention while filming this video is that all of these flights were done on 3 acres that were owned by my family. While on many occasions we were way too close from the flight, close to the rocket going off, we were assuming low power rocketry rules. By the time I was flirting around with 4 motors, I should not have been applying by those rules, and I learned with each successive flight to stand further back. That's part of why my IPER launch control box has so much cable between me and the rocket, is that I don't want to be anywhere near it. So while there's a lot of mistakes you're seeing in what you just watched, there was a lot of learning that happened as well.